Monday, 3rd of December, 1984. Bhopal, Madhya Pradesh, Central India. A murderous spectre spreads its wings and stalks the tightly packed streets of a poor Indian city in the dead of night. But this invisible killer is no ghost or phantom. It is a deadly, unseen cloud of poisonous gas, a gas that causes those unfortunate enough to be exposed to it for too long to literally drown in their own fluid-filled lungs, gasping, thrashing, struggling to breathe. But what had caused such a horrid thing to descend on the city? Who was responsible? Today, Descent into Darkness examines a story of corporate greed and negligence that led to the Bhopal chemical leak. Background: the plant and the science. The Union Carbide India Division plant in Bhopal in Madhya Pradesh, Central India, was constructed in 1969 for the sole production of the pesticide naphthyl methyl carbamate, known to the industry as carbaryl. At one time, the third most popular pesticide in the world. The discovery of the compound was a boon for the company as it was stupidly cheap to produce. The original process was a two-step method. Firstly, methylamine and phosgene were reacted together to form methyl isocyanate, or MIC. Remember this one, it's important. Then, the MIC would be reacted with 1-naphthol to form the final product, carbaryl, which was sold by Union Carbide under the brand name Sevin. The Indian subsidiary riffed on this process slightly to create MIC by reacting naphthol with the phosgene, which would create a chloroformate ester, which would then react with methylamine, which still yields MIC. The problem with Sevin was that Carbide had grossly overestimated the market demand, meaning that the plant and others like it elsewhere produced so much of the stuff that the supply far outstripped the global demand. In the case of the plant in Bhopal, this meant that the factory was ordered to wind down the production, only making a few tons a month. But despite the huge slump in production levels, the factory continued to produce MIC and store it away for future use. This meant that they were sitting on many hundreds of tons of the precursor and intermediary chemicals. Compounding this was the typical corporate bean counter exercise of cost-cutting. Inevitably, the easiest thing to cut became maintenance schedules, which were scaled back almost to the point of non-existence. Workers at the time reported that small leaks were commonplace and vital monitoring instruments and gauges rarely worked in the 15-year-old factory. Sadly, the warning signs of what was to come were there all along. In 1976, trade unions complained about the levels of pollution on the site, but these were ignored. Tragedy first hit the site in 1981 when a worker was somehow accidentally splashed with liquidized phosgene. Unfortunately, in his sheer panic, he did the worst thing that he could have possibly done in that situation. He removed his respirator. As the liquid evaporated from his body, he inhaled the gas. Phosgene, you might know, is infamous as one of the 3 agents used in the First World War, and would take the poor guy's life 3 days later. The next incident occurred in January of 1982, when 24 workers were again exposed to phosgene and had to be rushed to hospital. Thankfully, they all survived, but they reported that they had not been told to bother wearing any personal protective equipment, or PPE, whilst they were working. The following month, 18 workers were mildly exposed to MIC gas, and then, in August, one man received 30% burns on his entire body when he was splashed with liquid MIC. And then, if you can believe it, in October, another MIC leak caused injuries to 3 workers whilst attempting to stop this leak. One man received chemical burns, and 2 more were exposed to the gas. These incidents were highlighted by a local journalist, Rajkumar Keswani, who wrote multiple articles warning of the distinct possibility of an impending far greater disaster. But his sage warnings went unheeded. The leak. In the wee small hours of the night of the 2nd to the 3rd of December 1984, Safety Officer Suman Day responded to reports from his colleagues of a small leak in the factory. He walked around the whole site, using his nose to detect the unmistakable telltale scent of gas. After a while, he noticed a small amount of gas coming from a corroded pipe connection, but decided that it was so small that it could wait for the daytime crew to fix with their bigger team. He returned to the control room and told his workmates that it was nothing serious to worry about, so they resumed their previous chatter and copious amounts of tea drinking. Suddenly, at 0022, an alarm sounded. Suman rushed to the control panel and saw to his horror that the pressure in one of the MIC tanks had rocketed off the scale. With an air of panic in his step, he made his way toward the part of the plant that housed the 3 large MIC tanks encased in concrete. He felt the ground beneath him rumbling ominously, the small tremors making the dust and dirt on top of the concrete dance. At 0030, as Suman sprinted back to the control room, he heard a loud hissing noise echoing through the plant. He later described it as like that of a steam train. When he reached the control room again, he attempted to activate a vital piece of safety equipment called the vent gas scrubber, a tank that forced any errant gases through a column of caustic soda, which would have rendered the gas harmless. But the scrubber did not respond to the controls. But all is not yet lost. The next piece of safety equipment is a flare tower, whose job it was to burn off any excess gases. But once again, the lack of maintenance has now let the fully panicking workers down, as it fails to ignite. With this final safety feature all but useless, at 0100 there is nothing that could be done to prevent a deadly cloud of MIC being spewed into the midnight air. After a while, the dense gas began to settle back down toward the ground. It began to fill all the low-lying areas, like water slowly filling a bowl. The main area of the nearby city of Bhopal sat in a gentle valley that leads down to Lake Bhopal, and the gentle nighttime southeasterly breeze was blowing in that very direction. But still, efforts were being made to limit the scale of the leak at the plant, as the workers scrabbled to deploy water hoses to spray over the top of the vent chimney to dissolve the MIC gas and render it harmless. But in what now, if it were not so serious, could be easily described as a farce, the pump supplying the water did not have enough pressure for the stream to reach the top of the chimney. The workers were left stunned and practically pissing in the wind as the gas vented from the chimney for over half an hour, equating to around 42 tons of MIC. The factory tannoy broadcasted the message for all workers to evacuate. As the gas began to settle, the first signs of the unfolding disaster began to befall the citizens of Bhopal. Many of the poorer inhabitants who slept on the floor were woken to sudden severe irritation of the eyes. Those who could not physically stand up then slowly became unable to breathe comfortably, wheezing and coughing violently as if something was choking them. This means that the worst affected groups of people were the elderly, infants, and the disabled. As more and more gas settled, more and more people were affected in the city's densely packed streets and homes, eventually covering an area of 8 kilometers square. As the people woke to the irritation of their eyes and lungs, very soon a large panic ensued, with people taking to the streets with their families, running in all directions, trying to escape whatever it was that had taken them by such surprise. Others, not so fortunate, were lining the edge of the streets, hacking, coughing and vomiting, and dying. Back at the factory, Suman Day donned a respirator and headed back out into the site to search for anyone who had not been able to evacuate. Gas effects. The effects of methyl isocyanate gas on the body are many and varied. In small doses, the gas acts as an eye irritant, like the effects of tear gas. But with prolonged exposure, the problems soon begin to rack up. The most widely known symptoms are severe respiratory distress, including violent coughing and pulmonary edema, leading to effectively drowning in one's own fluids. Other effects, both acute and chronic, are circulatory collapse, cerebral edema, necrotizing enteritis, tubular necrosis of the kidneys, fatty degeneration of the liver, and is a known severe carcinogen. Quite the list of nasty problems, clearly all of which would result in death sooner or later. So, MIC can kill you now and later. Along with this, it is also estimated by scientists that other nasty gases were also present in the release: methylamine, dimethylamine, trimethylamine, hydrogen chloride, trichloromethane or chloroform, and carbon dioxide, all of which you really don't want in your body. Emergency response and heroes. Very quickly, the local hospital saw a rapidly increasing number of people presenting at the emergency department of Hamidiya Hospital with highly unusual complaints. Some only with severely irritated eyes, but, more worryingly, others with severe respiratory distress. One particular senior physician, Dr. Bandari, who had the night off and was at home, was contacted by his colleagues for a consult on this odd phenomenon. First, for the milder symptoms, he simply advised irrigation and eye drops to alleviate the irritation, and then resumed his cozy night in. But later, Dr. Bandari's phone rang again. His colleagues sounded much more concerned at the huge numbers of patients that were beginning to overwhelm the department. He agreed to come down to help, but in the meantime he decided to step outside to see if he could detect any gas. Very quickly he was overcome with a severe coughing fit. He staggered back inside and sat down to catch his breath. When Dr. Bandari arrived at the hospital, he saw the sheer scale of what they were facing. He knew there was no way that this was caused by ammonia, as the police had told him. With conventional treatments not working and the severity of the symptoms being far greater than what was expected, and with patients clogging every corridor, he phoned the Union Carbide plant, but they lied to him, at first saying it was phosgene. But as we know in hindsight, this was not what had caused the problem. But it was certainly a better fit for the respiratory problems for now, and so the team at the hospital soldiered on in treating the rapidly growing numbers. But still, people were not getting better. Something still did not add up. Finally, Union Carbide admitted to Dr. Bandari that they were in fact dealing with methyl isocyanate, something which he had never heard of before, much less how to treat. Many of those who were able to make it to the hospital could only be made comfortable to the best of the medical staff's abilities in the hope that their symptoms would soon abate. But, sadly, many thousands were not that lucky. By 0300, the mortuary at the Hamidiya Hospital was well and truly full, forcing the staff to place the dead in the only place they could, in the grounds outside, with a white bedsheet covering them. Hundreds of them, growing rapidly. It was only during the research for this script that I learned of a particularly outstanding act of selfless bravery that I would be severely remiss if I did not share with you. The station master of the Bhopal Junction railway station, Ghulam Dagastir, and his staff, rather than saving themselves, chose to stay and assist a huge number of people that descended on the station to get onto trains that were heading away from the city. They could have easily hopped on themselves as the train pulled away, but, out of sheer dedication to duty, they all stayed behind and helped those who were unable to get away. Their only protection from the gas were water-soaked rags tied about their faces. This did not stop them from suffering the tearing effects of the gas, but they continued doggedly on through irritated, streaming eyes and coughing, and I can't even carry on after cutting onions. Another act of bravery occurred further away from the city when a railway inspector, Gauri Shankar, upon learning the disaster, he defied direct orders from his superiors to stay away from Bhopal and loaded up his own personal inspection train with emergency supplies and, along with a small army of volunteers and medical professionals, went to Bhopal and greatly assisted in the rescue efforts at incalculable risk to their own lives. Once they arrived, Shankar was instrumental in organizing and coordinating rescue efforts and evacuations. So, I think it is safe to say that people like Ghulam Dagastir, who survived the disaster, finally passing away in 2003, and all of his station staff, many of whom didn't make it through the disaster, and Gauri Shankar and his brave volunteers are absolute fucking heroes who deserve to be remembered. Finally, at 0700, the gas had fully dissipated, making the city safe once more. The dead littered the streets, not just humans, but thousands of animals too. But now, there were lots of questions and very angry voices filling the air, all directed at the steel behemoth that towered over the city. Aftermath and investigation. As one can imagine, the overall impact of the disaster was, and still is, very difficult to gauge. The official known number of deaths is 3,787, although the Indian government claim that this number is actually as high as around 16,000. But by far, the most astounding statistic is the number of non-fatal injuries, estimated to be at least 551,125. In the immediate days following the fateful night, Union Carbide was very quick to begin downplaying the impact, but as the world media began to descend on Bhopal and Union Carbide's head office, the company switched tack, claiming that, rather than an accident, it had been a deliberate act of sabotage by some persons unknown. Company CEO Warren Anderson flew in to assess the damage for himself. When he touched down, the Indian police quickly arrested Anderson when they became aware of how important he was in the company. He was not taken to the local NIC, though. Instead, rather outrageously, he was held at Union Carbide's own corporate guest accommodation, which at that time was one of the finest and most luxurious spaces in the whole city, a millionaire's playground. The public became more and more incensed at this revelation as they felt that the arrest was merely a show for the cameras. Whilst he was being held, Anderson was allowed brief interviews with the press, assuring them that he was all well, which is hardly shocking given where he was spending his time. His internment did not last for long. A few hours later, Anderson was bailed, and he immediately buggered off on the next jet back to the US. He would never return. Investigators, led by Dr. Thiagarajan, arrived the very next morning to try and solve the puzzle of what had happened. Unfortunately, huge amounts of deadly chemicals, including 30 to 35 tons of MIC, remained within the huge factory's storage, almost the same amount as was leaked. Without a proper idea of what, if any, damage had been caused, it was felt that attempting to extract the remaining toxic ingredients from their tanks would be too time-consuming to perform safely. And so, with the very real possibility of another leak occurring in the meantime, they instead took the equally risky option to restart the factory and convert all of the remaining stock into Sevin pesticide in a move those in charge rather ominously codenamed Operation Faith. This decision sparked further panic and outrage from the people of Bhopal, as they greatly feared a repeat event. But the investigators are convinced that this was the best way to clear the factory, so they can properly examine what had happened. Many thousands of people decided to flee Bhopal for fear of another leak. The city almost became a ghost town. 13 days after the leak, on the 16th of December, with collectively held breath of all assembled, and the whole factory covered in wet canvas and water-carrying aircraft flying overhead, the buttons were pressed, and the factory sparked back into life. Thankfully, everything responded as normal, and the resultant containers of Sevin were taken away when all the precursors were finally used up, a full 7 days later. Operation Faith was a success. Dr. Thiagarajan was now confident enough to declare that the site was safe, leading to a slow return of Bhopali residents. The most obvious place to begin looking was the liquid MIC storage tanks, where Safety Officer Suman Dey had felt the whole area shaking beneath him. The incident had left behind large cracks and fissures in the reinforced concrete. Wrecking equipment was brought in to break through the huge block in which the 3 tanks sat. Once the rubble was cleared away, it was apparent that one tank in particular, labelled E610, had been subjected to a huge amount of sudden internal pressure, although thankfully it had not ruptured. The safety valve, however, was destroyed. But this could not have happened spontaneously. Something must have gotten into the tank to cause a runaway chain reaction that built up the pressure inside to the point of no return. Company policy dictated that only 2 of the 3 MIC tanks should have been filled at any one time, with the third being held as a backup. Those that were filled should have only held 50% of their overall capacity. However, due to the decreased demand, tank E610 was 75% full, and all 3 tanks had MIC in them. The cause was later found throughout the maze of pipes and tubes that made up the factory. The scaled-back maintenance of the plant had caused large sections of piping to become heavily corroded. Under standard practice, corroded sections of pipe should have been replaced as soon as it became known, but the severely restricted budgets had meant that the hamstrung workers could not carry out the work. Dr. Thiagarajan's team estimated that around half a ton of water had somehow found its way into tank E160. On its own, this would still have been a major problem. The presence of water will cause MIC to give off heat and begin to vaporize, but the water carried something else with it. Flakes of iron oxide, rust from the pipework. These flakes provided a catalyst for a much more violent exothermic reaction, and with the large amount of MIC in the tank, the reaction, once begun, was pretty much unstoppable. This hypothesis was repeated on a miniature scale under laboratory conditions to confirm. All of these findings were expanded upon by an independent US investigator named Michael Wright, a health and safety inspector from America's steel industry, who was forced to confine himself to the shadows during his fact-finding mission as the Indian government had denied him a work visa. Despite this setback, Wright was still able to procure pretty much all the information he needed, including photographs of the equipment of the plant, interviewing staff, and even managed to get hold of a copy of the technical manual and schematic for the whole factory. This was all the ammunition that Wright needed to help build his case against Union Carbide. He had found that the company had installed a jumper line from a chemical processing plant right next to the MIC storage area that connected it to the rest of the factory's pipework. The problem was that this chemical processing unit would regularly clog and need to be sluiced out with water. Another major failing was the cleaning schedules. Pipework was required to be regularly washed out with water section by section. These sections would be masked off by the use of a thin metal plate inserted between the junctions of two pipes, known as a slip blind. This kept that area of pipework separate from the rest of the network whilst the work was carried out, and the water drained afterwards. Then the slip blind would be removed, and that area could be used once more. At 21:30 on the night of the disaster, the pipe had been washed out by workers. They confided to Wright that initially they were a little worried when water had failed to come out of the end as expected. But then, after a little while, it did, and so they assumed all was normal. However, Wright found that to cut corners, the slip blinds which would have isolated that pipework circuit had not been used, and the water had managed to find its way via the jumper line into tank E610. But still, there was one final thing that could have prevented this contamination. When the liquid MIC was being stored in the tanks, the remaining space should have been pressurized with nitrogen, a famously inert and therefore stable gas. This top pressure should have kept anything else out. But of course, you already know that there was a problem. On the 30th of November, one worker stated that he had witnessed the team attempt to pressurize tank E160, but they were not able to. The team put it down to a faulty pressure gauge, but the worker himself stated that he knew that there must have been a leak in the line. He had checked the safety record book and found that this problem had been ongoing for around 20 days, and it had not been escalated up the chain of command for repairs. This meant that with nitrogen leaking out, it allowed water, and the rust particles it carried, in. The extreme pressure forced the liberated gas up through the factory pipework. The vent gas scrubber, even if it had been working, could not possibly have coped with the sheer volume of gas passing through. The flare tower was the only surefire way of ensuring that the disaster was averted, and that wasn't working either. Wright found that a 4-foot section of pipework leading to the flare tower had been removed due to corrosion 2 months previous, and had not yet been replaced. An easy 2-hour job. The pathetic water jets from the hoses and their undersized pump that were unable to reach the top of the chimney were the final nail in the coffin that led to the unspeakable disaster. To their credit, Union Carbide US had told their Indian subsidiary that the water spray pumps at the Bhopal plant were severely inadequate and that they should be replaced, but it had not been done. This comedy of errors, which, if not for the catastrophic loss of life and untold damage, would have been laughable, had led to one of the worst industrial accidents in history. Back in the USA, Warren Anderson, now home safe, continued to reiterate the claims of sabotage, going as far as to accuse an unknown worker of deliberately pumping water into the MIC tank, despite never really presenting anything in the way of evidence to this conclusion. Just another case of corporate arse covering. The aftermath of the disaster was too much for Union Carbide to weather. Their name was mud. 5 years after the disaster, they did agree a compensation settlement package of $470 million, but this only equated to around $600 per victim, around $771 in today's money. But this agreement came with a severe kick in the Bengalis. The company were able to negotiate immunity into the deal, meaning that they could never be sued in US courts ever again in relation to the Bhopal disaster. But in 2010, the Indian government were able to convict 8 former executives of Union Carbide India on the charge of death by negligence. Their sentence? A fine of roughly $2,000 per man. I cannot fucking even. Union Carbide soon went under, being bought out by the conglomerate Dow Chemical. It is now Dow that has inherited this awful legacy. To this day, they all remain resolute that this was still an act of sabotage. Warren Anderson retired in 1986 and was declared a fugitive from justice in 1992 by the Indian judiciary for failure to appear at a hearing on charges of culpable homicide and manslaughter. For months and years after, the gas leak continued to cause great numbers of medical complaints for those lucky enough to have survived the initial leak. Many more lives would be taken by the various long-term effects and comorbidities. Legacy. The Bhopal disaster still casts a dark shadow over the Indian people, a damning indictment of the deliberate exploitation and neglect of poorer countries. The true number of those affected will probably never be known. To this day, chronic respiratory diseases are common around Bhopal, and will no doubt remain so for many years yet. The abandoned Union Carbide plant was never dismantled, and the Indian government are rightly reluctant to attempt to do so themselves, for fear of possibly triggering a similar event. And so, the plant remains standing as a rusting, foreboding edifice, reminding people of the terrible December night. The exposed MIC tank E610 still stands at the site to this day. Personally, I think a more fitting use for this would be to dump it outside the gates of Dow Chemical's HQ, emblazoned with the words, "Justice for Bhopal," along with all the names of the known victims. Despite their pathetic protestations, it is obvious that Union Carbide, and by default Dow Chemical, have thousands of charges of corporate manslaughter for deliberate actions that led to this awful and entirely avoidable tragedy. The man who first attempted to warn the world of UC's failings, Rajkumar Keswani, died in 2019. If only the people had listened. Ex-CEO Warren Anderson died in 2014, at the age of 92. And I pity the poor undertakers having to try and wash the blood of 16,000 people off his hands. Sevin pesticide is still produced to this day, albeit under the generic name Carbaryl. Thank you for watching this video. I do hope you found it informative and interesting. If you did, please hit the like button and consider sharing it with a friend. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon and enable notifications to get informed of whenever I upload a new video. What do you think of the new production style? I think it's a great improvement, so thank you to Mr. Joe Marshall for the injection of a much-needed visual upgrade. Show him some love in the comments. What do you think of the Bhopal disaster? Let me know, and I will respond to as many as I can. Head on over to my alternate channel, DID Reads, for more great content from your favourite, soothing, smooth-voiced narrator. If you wish to do so, you can support DID on Patreon, link in the description below, or via the Super Thanks button if you wish to give a one-off donation. And in the meantime, take care of yourselves, and I shall see you on our next descent into darkness.